So we're going to discuss the first part of Jane Collier's an essay on the art of ingeniously tormenting. Now, if I were talking with my daughter and I were asked to defend including this work on the syllabus, I would immediately go to the frontispiece and I would point out the picture of the cat with the caption, "The cat doth play and after slay," and probably gain some dad points by doing that. Uh, that mischievous-looking cat seems to have all of the qualities that we have found in cats over the years. They look so cute and so cuddly, but yet somewhere right under the surface there is a very dark and a very vicious soul. In fact, I think I still have some scars from the last time I tried to pick up Letty, and she let me know how adept she was with all of her claws. Uh, an almost perfect representation of Letty, incidentally, appears on the cover of this recent edition of Collier's work, edited by Audrey Bilby of Santa Clara College. Uh, but there are more reasons to read The Art of Ingeniously Tormenting than the inclusion of cats, no matter how important cats might be to many of us. This work, published in 1753, is the first major satire written by a woman in the 18th century, or at least in 18th century England. We've read works by women that were published earlier, and including some satiric works like the Montague poem that we read earlier in the semester, and we can find satiric elements certainly in works like Mary Astle's Reflections upon Marriage, and even the works by Margaret Cavendish that we read. But in terms of a full length satirical piece, an essay on the art of ingeniously tormenting really is the first and in many ways the best example that we have of an 18th century woman writing a full-length work of satire. And for that reason alone, I think it's worth considering. But there are also some other reasons to read it. One is, as you'll see if you haven't already, it's really quite funny. And it's funny in a way that's very accessible. When we were going through Swift, especially through A Tale of a Tub, I hope you found some of the jokes to be funny eventually, but you really have to do a lot of digging. You need the footnotes. You you might have needed my explanation of things. There's a lot of work that we have to do to kind of get the jokes, and that really can kind of ruin a joke, as we may have discovered. This work is tremendously accessible. It seems almost familiar. In some ways, although the class structures and things which we'll talk about are very definitely 18th century and British. In other ways, it seems really very familiar. Some of the personal dynamics that are described are ones that we might recognize in ourselves and the relationships that we have with others. You'll also know, and I think this will be very much to your delight, that Collier's style is refreshingly accessible. Uh, if we think back to some of the other prose writers that we've read, and I'm thinking of Cavendish and Astle, I'm also thinking of Swift, particularly in A Tale of a Tub. The prose itself was just hard to get through. It, it's dense. The sentences tend to be long and convoluted. They're often tremendously elusive, and they're just hard to figure out. When we get to Collier, we're reading someone who almost seems as if she has come through some freshman comp courses, or maybe taken some of her work to the writing center, because we find some of those qualities of clarity and concision, uh, of ease and accessibility that we prize in prose. It's one of the reasons that this work is so much fun to read, and and so easy to read. But still, there are other reasons that we want to read it as well. Uh, when we think of the 18th century, and we've talked a little bit about these ideas, one of the old, and it's not a very accurate way of looking at the 18th century, is to say that when we start in the Restoration in 1660, we're in an age of reason, right? And sometimes called the Age of Enlightenment. It's sometimes called an Age of Reason. And we find these writers who are celebrating rationality and celebrating uh, that a kind of cold logic and induction and the new science, all those things we've talked about in association with the organization of the Royal Society and the scientific writing and uh, the kind of rational arguments that we find and even in some of the satires that we've been reading. And the view is that as we get to the end of the 18th century, as we start moving into the 1770s and 1780s, all of that rationality melts into sentiment. And we start finding, for example, these sentimental novels that become very, very popular. Works like Henry Mackenzie's A Man of Feeling or Oliver Goldsmith's The Vicar of Wakefield. Works that are, they're kind of hard to read now because it's very hard to understand the reading aesthetic. Uh, they're maudlin, they're overwrought. They have these characters who are too good for life, who just get treated horribly and beaten up and abused, and we weep for them as they go through all of their torments. Uh, this was a kind of literature that became tremendously popular in the late 18th century. Critics have sometimes said that the way we're supposed to read it is not really as literature, but but we're to consume it in almost the same way that one would consume pornography. Now, hang with me just a minute on this one. The argument goes something like this: that one uh, consumes pornography for its effects. One is looking for what it does to a person, the emotions, even the somatic responses that it might create. One reads it for what it does to one. With the sentimental literature, one reads it also for an emotional and a somatic effect, just a different one. In place of the erotic, one substitutes the sentimental. So one reads it for exactly the reason that uh, grade school children might go back to that favorite book. And I remember Old Yeller being really popular with some of my classmates, and they'd read it over and over again. And every time they would read it, they would cry. Or the way that some people like to watch that sad movie that they've watched a million times because they know that it will always allow them that kind of emotional release of being able to of being able to cry when they get to the ending of it. That's really how the sentimental fiction worked. And there was even this idea that this cult of sensibility that suggested that being so sensitive, so in tune to one's emotions, that one would have these physical responses to the literature, that one would begin weeping and maybe even faint and lose all sense of self-control, that was a sign of one's virtue. That was a sign that one truly had a benevolent heart, for surely he would be a cold and calculating person who would not have that kind of response. Now, as I said, those novels, and I teach them sometimes. When I do a novels course, we'll do a short one, are very hard to teach now because we tend to laugh at them. But that view, and it's an inaccurate one, but it's a common one, that the 18th century starts in rationality and then melts into sentimentality, is one that Jane Collier's work really complicates. And that's one of the areas that I want us to focus on when we're meeting in the discussion board. Now, we've seen other works that have complicated that dichotomy. Swift, when we got to the end of Gulliver's Travels, right? And we start seeing that the moral center of that work might be people like Captain Pedro de Menendez, the Portuguese sea captain, who, for no logical or rational or good reason, chooses to care for Gulliver and to see his safe passage home, even while risking his own well-being and the well-being of his men. He becomes, in a way, a hero of it, and he responds not out of rationality or out of reason, but out of a kind of sentimentality, kind of emotional attachment. We see those same dynamics in Gulliver's family, who continue to love him and care for him even while he rejects them. And we see the limitations of a life of pure rationality in the Wyndhams, who become prideful. We could say in some ways almost like fascists, and they have all of the cruelty that their pride and their rationality, whatever that might actually be, allows them. We could see something similar uh, when we look at A Modest Proposal, where again we have a narrator in love with his own rationality, the calculations, the economic projections that he makes, um, the, the cool precision of the whole thing. And because he lacks those softer sentimental qualities, proposes something absolutely barbarous and monstrous, almost uh, beyond the imagination to conceive of. So that dichotomy or that idea of a progression from rationality to sentimentality is an oversimplification. And I want us to examine The Art of Ingeniously Tormenting as a work that in some ways will show us exactly how faulty that that simplification is. So the work was published in 1753. Uh, Collier, as you would know if you did any reading about her, and she's a really interesting figure, uh, was a woman who had a benefit of a tremendous education, largely through her father and through her brothers, who were university educated and members of the clergy and very good classicists. Uh, they taught her Latin. They taught her some Greek. She was very widely read. Uh, she was in the unfortunate position of trying to make her way as a writer in the 18th century. We saw with the views of the Grub Street writers and A Tale of a Tub and even those desperate folks who seem to be invading Pope's privacy and quiet in the Epistle to Dr. Arbuthnot, we saw how tenuous and uncertain the life of an author could be in the 18th century, and it was even worse for women. Collier was writing to try to sustain herself. She did many of her works uh, are I let me back up on that. She contributed uh, to many of the works written by her friend Sarah Fielding, and Fielding may very well have influenced this work also. In fact, it's almost certain that the title of this work comes from a passage in Sarah Fielding's first novel, David Simple, where there's a discussion from the character Cynthia of people who ingeniously torment. Now, even that association shows us the problems of that idea of rationality on one side and sentimentality on the other. Fielding's novel, published in the early 1740s, is sometimes not really accurately but understandably called a novel of sensibility. It's more than that, but it is something of a novel of sensibility. Uh, Collier is responding to a work by Swift and is writing, in some ways, a kind of satire uh, that reflects that earlier age of reason. Yet the origin of her work, the one that she's responding to, is one that uh, was written by her sometimes co-author that really anticipates the sentimental fiction that comes, in some ways, anticipates the sentimental fiction that comes towards the end of the century. So already we're seeing that dichotomy breaking down. When we meet in the discussion board, I want us to examine how that dichotomy breaks down even further by thinking of a couple of things. One is uh, the nature of the victims in this piece. And I think it would be fair to say that as we've looked at satires throughout this semester, the people who are being ridiculed and the people who are being treated cruelly often appear to us as cartoonish characters who either don't seem capable of experiencing the kind of emotions of hurt that we would experience, or seem to deserve whatever treatment they receive. In this text, we also see the victims of cruelty, and they become, in some ways, for us, the most developed. They're not developed like we would find in a novel, but they become real for us, the most real characters within the text. There are authors, and I guess if today's the day that I'm going to talk, however briefly, about pornography, I might as well talk about sadomasochism as well. There are critics of this text that call attention to the sadomasochistic dimensions of it. In fact, there's there's some modern works, and I can give you the references if you're interested in them, that connect this work to larger theories of the psychology of sadomasochism, and with suggestions that sort of permeates a lot of human relationships. That's an issue for a very different course than one that I would teach. But if we think about those kinds of dynamics, they're dynamics that have a lot to do with suffering, right? There's the person who inflicts the suffering and the person who receives the suffering. In this text, we experience the suffering. We see the characters who are the victims of the kind of torment that the author is ostensibly advocating it for her and her readers. Uh, and I want us to examine that idea to see how that helps us see how this work belongs both to an age of satire and how it anticipates not only the sentimental fiction, but also the kind of moral instruction that we have uh, that we've referenced when I've told you about works like Adam Smith's The Theory of Moral Sentiments, published really just a few years after this work in 1759. So we're going to talk about that in the discussion board. And I also want us to talk about how the scope of this satire changes. When we're looking at Swift, and we can think of a modest proposal, or we can think of a tale of a tub, he's thinking in some ways about society as a whole, right? I mean, he wants to reform culture. He wants to defend the Anglican communion and attack those faith traditions that he sees as being detrimental to social order. If we're looking um, at a modest proposal, he's talking about big economic policies that are related to mercantilism and colonialism and how they affect not only the individual but the whole population of Ireland. In this work, do you notice that our scope turns from the view of society as a whole, that view that Gulliver has as the giant person looking down on Lilliput when he can see all of it, to something really much more intimate and domestic? This is not a work so much about reforming society as it is about putting one's home, one's family, one's intimate relationships in order. That's a distinction that, again, we can map onto a change from the early to the later parts of the 18th century, and one that we can also map onto the emergence of more women writers coming into the marketplace. It is a shift from a literature that addresses itself to a public sphere to a literature that deals with a more domestic sphere. That's something else that I want to talk about. Well, I have talked too much. Uh, you will have to talk tomorrow. I will see you all then. Take care.